Judge recognizes childhood friend on trial. What happens next will shock everyone. If you're loving these stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stick around for more. The courtroom buzzed with its usual mix of tension and routine. Papers shuffled, murmurs filled the air, and the faint sound of a gavel echoed from another room. Judge Ava Carter sat at the bench, her expression calm but focused, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood. For her, this was just another case in a long line of cases. At least, that's what she thought. The bailiff cleared his throat and called the next case. The state of Florida versus Michael Turner. Ava barely glanced up at first, her eyes skimming over the docket. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. Another string of poor decisions leading someone to her courtroom. She sighed inwardly, preparing herself for the usual. But then, the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and the defendant walked in. For a moment, Ava's grip on her gavel faltered. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked at the man in shackles. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was Michael Turner. And Michael Turner wasn't just any defendant. He was the boy she'd once known as Mike Heath, kid she grew up with, raced bikes with, and made pinky promises with under the oak tree in her backyard. The room seemed to spin as the memories rushed back. The carefree laughter, the summer afternoons, and the unspoken bond they shared. But now, Mikey didn't look like the boy she remembered. His shoulders were slumped, his face was weathered, and his eyes, so full of hope, were now clouded with resignation. Ava quickly straightened in her seat, forcing herself to remain composed. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her, "you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" Mikey's voice was rough, strained, as if it hadn't been used in years. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Ava felt her chest tighten. For the first time in her career, she struggled to stay impartial. She couldn't stop the questions from racing through her mind. "What happened to you, Mikey? How did we end up here?" As the prosecutor began the opening statements, Ava's mind wandered back to a time long ago, a time when life seemed simpler, and the boy standing before her wasn't a defendant, but her best friend. Ava's mind drifted as the prosecutor spoke, her voice blending into the background noise of the courtroom. She wasn't here, not really. Her thoughts had already carried her back to Hammond, Florida, to a dusty little town where she and Mikey Turner were inseparable. Their friendship wasn't supposed to happen not in Hammond. She lived in a tidy house with a white fence on Maple Street. He lived at the far end of a dirt road, in a weathered house surrounded by overgrown fields. Two worlds that weren't meant to cross, but somehow they had. They met by accident one summer day. Ava had wandered too far from her backyard and found herself by a creek she'd never explored. Mikey was there, fishing with a stick and some twine, cursing under his breath as his line got tangled in the reeds. She couldn't help but laugh. "You're doing it all wrong," she said, stepping closer. Mikey had squinted at her, suspicious at first, but then grinned. "And you know how to do it better?" "I bet I do." And just like that, it began. What started as a chance encounter turned into endless days of sneaking off to meet by the creek. They rode bikes down old dirt roads, climbed trees, and made up secret codes that no one else could understand. They talked about everything: school, dreams, fears. But it wasn't all innocent fun. Even as kids, they felt the weight of the world pressing in. Hammond had its unspoken rules, and their friendship broke every single one of them. People whispered. Neighbors stared. And Ava's father didn't bother to hide his disapproval. One night, lying under the stars, Mikey turned to her and asked, "Do you ever think about leaving? Like, really leaving? Going somewhere we don't have to worry about all this crap?" Ava had laughed nervously, brushing off the question. "Sure, Mikey. We'll run away and start our own town. You can fish and I don't know, be the mayor or something." But Mikey wasn't joking. Even back then, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. Their bond grew stronger with every whispered conversation and stolen moment, but the pressure around them grew too. Hammond didn't just frown on friendships like theirs, it crushed them. It all ended one sweltering August afternoon, right before high school started. Ava's father caught them sitting together on the porch. His voice was sharp, like a whip. "Ava, get inside. Now." She hesitated, glancing at Mikey, who stood frozen. "Go on," he said softly, his voice carrying a resignation far beyond his years. "I'll see you later." But later never came. Mikey's family moved away not long after, and Ava buried herself in her studies, determined to escape Hammond and everything it stood for. She went to law school, chasing justice and fairness, but she never forgot the boy who had once been her best friend. And now, decades later, he was standing in her courtroom, accused of a crime that could steal his freedom forever. The charges against Michael Turner weren't just words on a piece of paper, they felt like a punch to Ava's gut. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. These weren't the kinds of things Mikey would have done and not the boy she once knew. But then again, the man standing before her wasn't that boy anymore. As the bailiff read the charges, Ava tried to focus, but her mind kept slipping. She glanced at Mikey. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shackled. He looked small, defeated. The prosecutor began, his tone clinical and detached, rattling off the details of the case like they were nothing more than lines in a script. On the night of June 5th, the defendant, Michael Turner, allegedly entered a convenience store in downtown Jacksonville, assaulted the clerk, and emptied the cash register before fleeing the scene. The defendant was apprehended 2 blocks away with the stolen cash in his possession. It all sounded so open and shut, so black and white. But Ava knew life was never that simple. She studied Mikey's face as the prosecutor spoke. He didn't react, no flinch, no frown. His expression was a carefully constructed mask, but Ava could see the cracks. And then came the evidence. First, the surveillance video, a grainy black and white recording from a cheap store camera. The figure on the screen moved quickly, dressed in a hoodie, their face hidden in the shadows. The prosecutor pointed at the screen. "The prosecution will prove that the person in this video is Michael Turner." Ava leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. The footage was bad, too dark, too blurry. Could it really be him? Next came the arresting officer's report. Officer Mark Hayes testified that Mikey had been found near the scene wearing dark clothing that matched the suspect's description. But something didn't sit right. As the prosecutor continued, Ava's gaze kept drifting back to Mikey. The man in the courtroom wasn't the same person she remembered, but that didn't mean he was guilty. She needed more. She needed the truth. The defense attorney, a young but sharp woman named Lauren Jacobs, finally rose to speak. "Your Honor, the evidence presented here is circumstantial at best. The video is inconclusive, and the officer's testimony is vague. My client has maintained his innocence from the start." Ava tried to keep her face impassive, but inside she felt like she was being torn in two. She had a job to do, a responsibility to the law. But she couldn't stop the question from repeating in her mind. How did Mikey end up here? It wasn't just a case anymore. It was personal. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as the defense began chipping away at the prosecution's story. For Ava, it was becoming harder to stay detached. She wasn't just Judge Carter anymore. Every word, every testimony was pulling her deeper into the tangled mess of her past with Mikey Turner. Lauren Jacobs, Mikey's defense attorney, stood tall and confident as she cross-examined the first witness, a clerk who had been working at the convenience store the night of the robbery. His testimony had seemed solid at first. A man in a red hoodie entered the store, got into an argument with the cashier, and then lunged across the counter to grab the cash. But Lauren wasn't about to let it slide. "Mr. Kelly," she began, her tone sharp but composed, "you stated earlier that the suspect was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" The clerk nodded. "Yes, that's right. And you also testified that it was late at night, correct? The store wasn't well lit?" "Well, yeah," the clerk admitted, fidgeting slightly. Lauren paced slowly, her heels clicking against the floor. So, just to clarify, you didn't see the suspect's face clearly. Is that correct? The clerk hesitated, glancing at the prosecutor. I mean, not really. He had the hood up. Thank you. Lauren turned to the jury, letting the silence linger for a moment before she continued. So, you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the person who committed the robbery? The clerk shifted uncomfortably. No, I guess not. Guess not. Lauren repeated, her voice calm but pointed. No further questions. Ava glanced at the jury. A few of them exchanged glances, doubt creeping into their expressions. Mikey sat at the defense table, his posture still slouched, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, now small, but there. Next came the surveillance video. It had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, but as it played on the screen, Ava felt a knot form in her stomach. The footage was terrible, grainy, and poorly lit, with the suspect's features completely obscured. The prosecution would have you believe this is Michael Turner, Lauren argued. But take a closer look. The figure in this video is little more than a shadow. Could this be my client? Sure. But it could just as easily be someone else entirely. The burden of proof lies with the state, and so far, they've proven nothing. Ava studied the jury again. Some were nodding, their skepticism growing. Others still seemed unconvinced, their arms crossed tightly as they watched the video on loop. The final blow to the prosecution's narrative came when Lauren questioned the arresting officer, Mark Hayes. The man's gruff demeanor and clipped responses only made him seem defensive. Officer Hayes, Lauren began, her tone almost too polite. You testified that my client matched the description of the suspect, a black male in his 40s wearing dark clothing. Is that correct? That's correct, Hayes replied firmly. And in your report, you mentioned that my client was not wearing a red hoodie when he was arrested. Is that also correct? Yes, but... Lauren cut him off, her voice rising just slightly. And did you or any other officers search the area for the red hoodie the suspect allegedly wore? Hayes hesitated, his jaw tightening. No, we didn't. Why not? We didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly. Lauren's eyebrows shot up. So, to be clear, you arrested my client based solely on a vague description and without any physical evidence connecting him to the crime? Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I followed protocol. Protocol, Lauren repeated, letting the word hang in the air. No further questions. The room buzzed with murmurs as the officer stepped down, his credibility visibly shaken. Ava's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't supposed to feel this way, conflicted, torn, but she couldn't help it. The cracks in the prosecution's case were growing, and with every piece of testimony, the doubt in her mind only deepened. For the first time, Ava wondered if justice was even possible in a system so eager to condemn. When Michael Turner took the stand, the courtroom went silent. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Ava tried to focus, her face a mask of professionalism, but inside, her thoughts churned. She wasn't looking at just another defendant. She was looking at the boy who used to swear he'd never let the world break him. Now that boy stood before her in chains, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges of the witness stand. Lauren Jacobs, his defense attorney, had warned him about the risks of testifying. It's dangerous, Mikey. They're going to try and twist your words. But Mikey had insisted. I need them to hear me. I need her to hear me. The courtroom watched as Mikey took a deep breath and began. His voice, though soft, carried a rawness that cut through the tension like a blade. I've made mistakes, he started, his eyes scanning the jury, then flickering briefly to Ava. I'm not here to tell you I'm perfect. I've done things I'm not proud of. But I didn't do this. He paused, his throat working as he swallowed hard. That night, I was walking home. I wasn't in any store. I wasn't hurting anyone. The cops stopped me because I looked like someone they were looking for. That's it. They didn't ask questions. They didn't care about the truth. They saw what they wanted to see. Ava felt her chest tighten. His words weren't just a testimony, they were a mirror, reflecting every unspoken truth about the world they'd both grown up in. Mikey continued, his voice cracking slightly. I've spent my whole life being judged for things I didn't do, for things I didn't choose, and I'm tired. I'm tired of being seen as guilty before anyone even knows me. I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for justice, for fairness. The room stayed silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling like dust after a storm. Ava glanced at the jury. Their faces showed a mix of emotions, some skeptical, others visibly moved. Mikey sat down, his chains clinking softly as he lowered himself into the chair. His gaze stayed fixed on the floor, as if he didn't dare look at anyone else. Ava, however, couldn't take her eyes off him. She knew her role. She was supposed to remain impartial, to make decisions based on evidence and law. But at that moment, she didn't see Michael Turner, the defendant. She saw Mikey, the boy who used to dream under the stars and talk about leaving Hammond behind. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if the system she'd dedicated her life to could deliver the justice he deserved. The air in the courtroom was electric, heavy with anticipation, as everyone waited for the jury to return. The hours had dragged on, each second a slow drip of tension. Michael Turner sat quietly at the defense table, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. Judge Ava Carter tried to keep her face neutral, but her heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment that would decide whether the boy she once knew as Mikey would walk free or spend years behind bars. The door creaked open, and the jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. Ava's eyes followed the foreperson as she clutched a single piece of paper in trembling hands. For a brief moment, Ava wasn't in the courtroom anymore. She was back in Hammond, standing by the creek where she and Mikey used to meet, laughing about nothing and dreaming about everything. But the voice of the foreperson snapped her back to reality. In the case of the state of Florida versus Michael Turner, we find the defendant. The pause was unbearable. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, every eye glued to the foreperson. Not guilty. The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. A gasp rippled through the spectators. Some murmured in shock, others in relief. A few cheers even broke out before Ava's gavel struck hard, demanding order, but none of it mattered to Michael. His shoulders sagged, the tension visibly draining from his body. He didn't smile, he didn't cry, he just sat there, staring at his hands as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. For Ava, the relief was almost overwhelming, but it came with a bitter edge. The system had worked this time, but just barely. She glanced at the prosecutor, whose jaw was tight with frustration, and then at Lauren Jacobs, who was whispering something to Michael. The young attorney looked proud but exhausted, like she'd just fought a battle she wasn't sure she'd win. "Mr. Turner," Ava said, her voice firm but softer than usual, "the jury has spoken." The sound of her gavel was drowned out by the noise of the room coming alive again. Michael stood slowly, his chains clinking one last time before they were removed. He glanced briefly at Ava, their eyes meeting for the first time since the trial began. There was no anger in his gaze, no gratitude either, just a quiet, guarded acknowledgement. As the room emptied, Ava stayed behind, watching Michael sign his release papers. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say to make up for the years that had separated them, for the system that had almost swallowed him whole? Michael paused at the door, his back straight but his steps slow. For a moment, Ava thought he might leave without a word, but then he turned, his voice low but clear. "Thanks for being fair," he said. There was no warmth in his tone, just a quiet honesty that hit her harder than any accusation. And then he was gone, disappearing into the world that had always been so much harsher to him than it ever was to her. Ava sat alone in the now empty courtroom, staring at the polished surface of her bench. She had upheld the law, she had done her job, but why did it feel like she had barely done enough? The courtroom was empty now, the once buzzing energy replaced by an eerie stillness. Judge Ava Carter remained seated at the bench, staring down at the gavel in her hand, but her mind was somewhere far away. The trial was over. The jury had spoken. Michael Turner was free. But the weight in her chest didn't go away. She watched him as he finished signing his release papers. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he didn't trust that freedom was really his. Ava thought about leaving, slipping out the back door like she usually did, but her feet wouldn't move. Before she knew it, Michael turned and walked toward her, stopping just a few feet from the bench. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Michael broke the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, raw and unfiltered. "You knew, didn't you? From the first moment I walked in, you knew who I was." Ava's throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, to lie and say she'd only realized halfway through the trial, but she couldn't. Not to him. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "So why didn't you say anything?" "Not a word, Ava. Not a look. Nothing." Her name on his lips felt heavier than the gavel in her hand. She stood, trying to meet his eyes, but the hurt there was hard to face. "Because I couldn't," she said, her voice trembling slightly. If I'd let it show that I knew you, it could have ruined the case. It could have given them a reason to challenge the verdict. You deserved a fair trial." Michael let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Fair." He repeated the word like it was a joke. "The world's never been fair to me, Ava. Not once, and you know that." Her shoulders sagged under the weight of his words. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's not fair. It's never been fair, not to you, not to so many others. But I did what I thought was right. I thought it was the only way to help you." For a moment, the anger in his eyes softened, replaced by something she couldn't quite place. He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe this was the only way. But it still feels like you stood on the other side, you know? Like you're part of this system that almost swallowed me whole." Ava's chest ached. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she'd fought for justice her whole life. But hadn't he just spent days in her courtroom proving how flawed that justice could be? "I wish I could have done more," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "Back then. And now. But I don't know how to fix any of this, Mikey. I really don't." Michael studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible gesture. "We were just kids, Ava. We didn't know any better, but we're not kids anymore. And now you do know." His words hit her like a punch to the gut, but they were true. She nodded slowly, unable to argue. Michael turned to leave, but he paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "You were my best friend once. I'm not sure what we are now, but thanks, I guess, for letting me walk out of here." Ava couldn't respond. She just watched as he walked out of the courtroom, his back straight but his steps heavy, like a man carrying the weight of a lifetime. When the door closed behind him, Ava finally let herself sit down, her head falling into her hands. The law had done its job, but her heart told her the real work was just beginning. The courthouse was silent now, the kind of stillness that only comes after the storm. Judge Ava Carter stood at the top of the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. She watched the street below as people moved on with their lives, oblivious to the trial that had just unfolded inside. Michael Turner was gone. She'd watched him walk out those same doors only minutes before, his back straight but his steps slow. He hadn't looked back. For a long moment, Ava just stood there, staring at the world beyond the courthouse. The weight of the trial lingered on her shoulders, heavier than her black robes. The jury's verdict had set Michael free, but the truth of his words, spoken and unspoken, was still echoing in her mind. "The world's never been fair to me, Ava. Not once." Those words weren't just his, they belonged to so many others who had passed through her courtroom. People who had been failed by the system, by society, by the very ideals she'd once believed she was upholding. She thought about the version of herself who had left Hammond all those years ago, a bright-eyed girl with dreams of becoming a judge and making the world a better place. But had she? Inside, she had done everything right, followed the rules, remained impartial, upheld the law. But out here, under the fading light of the sun, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she had barely scratched the surface of what needed to change. Michael's voice echoed in her mind again. "We're not kids anymore, and now you do know." He was right. She knew now. She couldn't pretend she didn't see the cracks in the system, couldn't ignore the way those cracks swallowed people whole, people like Michael. Ava stepped down from the courthouse steps, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward her car. She didn't look back at the building that had defined her for so long. Instead, she looked forward to a future she wasn't sure how to change but knew she had to try. Her mind raced with thoughts of what could come next. Maybe it was time to stop just upholding the law and start questioning it. Maybe it was time to do more than pass judgment from a bench. She had a platform, a voice, and the privilege of power. Now she had to figure out how to use it. As Ava opened the door to her car, she glanced at the sky, the fading sun painting it in hues of orange and purple. For a moment, she let herself hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to change things, to honor the boy Michael Turner used to be and fight for the man he'd become. She slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly as if holding on to her resolve. The courthouse loomed in her rearview mirror as she drove away, its shadow stretching across the road like a reminder. Ava made a silent vow as she disappeared into the night. She couldn't rewrite the past, but she'd make damn sure the future wasn't just a hollow promise of fairness. It would be hard, maybe impossible, but she owed it to Michael and to herself to try.